Hello, thank you for joining us today for this inaugural event for the Global Resilience Commission meeting. Today's webinar is on critical infrastructure resilience. It's sponsored by the Electric Infrastructure Security Council and our network partners. A few housekeeping notes. We're not going to take live questions on this webinar today, but feel free to put questions in the question box on the webinar control panel, and we will answer those offline. Again, this is our first adventure for the Global Resilience Commission, and I'm glad you all made time to be with us today. Today on our agenda, we're going to kick off by Mr. Avi Schnur, the President and CEO of the EIS Council. I'll be turning this over to Mr. Frank Koza, who is our Critical Infrastructure Security Coordinator, who will engage with three outstanding experts in this field. Mr. Terry Boston, who will be talking about making energy sector robust, reliable. David Rube, who is going to talk about the electric sector and the impact from COVID. And then Mr. Danny Lacker in Israel is going to talk about water security and emergencies in difficult times. So again, we've got an outstanding panel to talk to us today and engage us. Feel free to put your questions in the question panel. And I'm going to turn it over now to someone who's led our resilience efforts for many years now, our President and CEO, Mr. Avi Schnur.
Hey, thank you, John, and really thanks everyone for joining. I wanted to say good morning, but it could be good afternoon, it could be good evening. People are joining from really all over the world. We really appreciate it. You know, this is, as John, as you said, the first event in a major new collective initiative, and it is wonderful and exciting to see the level of interest. So where all of this comes from, if we're going to talk about the vision that drives GRCOM, the Global Resilience Commission, it comes from our experience of a collective tragedy, the COVID-19 crisis. And the real tragedy there was the fact that, as we discovered, we simply were not prepared for a crisis at the scale that we now see that we're suffering. Where does this come from? So, as you can see on the slide, really globalization seems to be at the root of much of this. Of course, all sectors, all nations increasingly are interconnected today, and that's a good thing. That's where everything we value, everything that we use today tends to come from. It's a good thing until it's not. In a heavily interdependent system, really much like a biological organism, when you have disruption in any major sector, that can cause system-wide collapse. So that's the challenge. The answer to the challenge that we'll be talking about today is private sector hosted global scale resilience planning. And the emphasis there is on private sector because that's where everything that nurtures all of us, all over the world, all businesses comes from. And it needs to be focused on implementable near-term needs, because if this is not to become yet another example of something which dissipates into sort of vague strategic thoughts, that means it will have to be near-term. John, is something you've emphasized time and time again, and it will need to be a series of implementable steps. So what is the scope? What we need to do here, very importantly, is to try to avoid the trap of fighting the last war. You know, we need to come up with cost-effective resilience planning, but that planning needs to address not just the assumption that perhaps in a few years we'll see another pandemic, perhaps somewhat worse. That needs to be addressed, but we really have no idea what the hazard is that will hit us next. It could be a pandemic, it could be a consequence of extreme climate change, it could be a regional earthquake zone that happens in exactly the wrong location, which then ripples out and cascades into a huge problem. We don't know, so we need to be prepared for all of the extreme hazards. And that makes the scale enormous. Please go to the next slide. Oh, you've already done that. When I talk about this scale, I thought, as you can see here on this slide, there are a few examples of how serious our task really is. Even the terminology to address a set of hazards on the scale we're experiencing today has to be invented. So you can see three examples. What we tend to talk about if there's a very large-scale crisis that includes, for example, a large area power outage. So we talk about restoration, and obviously that's needed, but it's not enough. What's needed is timely, Lifeline compatible restoration. So perhaps we should be talking about a new acronym, LCR. Supply chain risk management, SCRM, again, very important, generally cyber related, but once again, it's not going to be enough. As we've seen, what we're dealing with now and have to find a way to address is supply chain fragility, much, much broader. Perhaps we should start talking about SCF. There are great tools that exist today that are used in conventional disasters, used in business as usual situations as well. That's important, but when we deal with extreme hazards on this scale, we will need to have available to us catastrophe optimized all sector tooling, or COAST. Once again, maybe a new acronym that we need to start moving into the common language that we all use when we talk about what we're investing in, what we're preparing for. The good thing is the resource that we have is the best minds of committed leaders from all across the world. And with that resource, the product that we need to develop is very specific. An evolving GRCOM framework, a global resilience framework that can then be briefed worldwide. It will, of course, evolve and be rebriefed, but that's what's going to be needed, and we need to make sure it's broad enough to cover the full scope of the hazards. So your hosts for this event are EIS Council and a growing array of partners. If you represent an organization that would be interested in getting involved, please do get in touch with us. We would love to have you. So in summary, this is a large challenge, but let's look at what the reality, the scope of the resources really includes all of us, all people, all businesses worldwide. This is something that we can deal with, we can address if we can stay focused. And this series of webinars represents the first attempt that we're hosting with our colleagues to begin working to develop that process. So thank you very much. John, back to you.
Thanks, Avi. I appreciate that. It's my pleasure now to introduce our facilitator for today, a guy I've got great respect for, Mr. Frank Koza, has a long background in critical infrastructure. Frank, I'll turn it over to you to facilitate the discussion and presentation by our panel members. Thank you.
Okay, John, thanks very much. Appreciate the introduction and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us on the webinar. As John mentioned, we've got three excellent speakers to present today on resilience issues, global supply chain issues, and the worldwide impact of COVID. We're going to lead off with Terry Boston. Terry is Board Vice Chair of the Grid Protection Alliance, a member of the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, and former CEO at PJM Interconnection, not to mention a long career at TVA to go with it. Terry's comments will focus on current resilience issues in the energy sector, but also focus on the interrelationships among the critical infrastructures. Terry?
Thank you, Frank, and thanks, Avi, for including me in this presentation. I kind of focused on reliable, robust, and resilient. Resilient is a new word. We have added to our vocabulary in the last 5 years or so, And I define it as the ability to take a licking and keep on ticking from a Timex commercial of my youth. So it's becoming more and more important as I'll show you the events. But the National Academy of Engineering, which I'm a proud member, was asked to say, what are the most important engineering achievements of the last century? It's no surprise to this call that the grid and electrification. Nothing has improved our standard of living more. Nothing has improved our productivity more than electricity. And there's some pretty important things, John, a couple of clicks there, some pretty important things in the sector above. 6 of the remaining 9 are powered by electricity. Some very important stuff, as Danny will tell you, on water supply and pumps and keeping that system working, and refrigeration. Going forward, the governor of California recently said in 15 years we will have electrification of all of the light fleet, which I think is very achievable and is going to happen. So the point of this slide is the importance of what we're focused on here today. And to show that importance, I will say, next slide. Electricity is so important. Power engineering is not rocket science. It is much more important than that. The economy shuts down when there is a power outage. Life as we know it has changed very much. But not only that, it's a feedstock to all the other critical infrastructure, what Avi calls is the metagrid. Next slide. You have a power guy making the presentation, so he put electricity in the center of this. Easy, Danny, water could be there, telecom could be there, for example. But as I build out this slide, I want to say electricity is the driver of the compressors, the pumps for both water and for oil, liquid fuels, and the telecom system as we know it. Even the cell phone systems, as I'll talk about later, failed during Katrina. But as you can see from this drawing, oil is providing the lubricants we need for the power sector, the transportation sector. Telecom is, in my opinion, very much part of any restoration effort. So this metagrid that Avi has come up with the concept of kind of ties it all together, saying of the critical infrastructures, we must continue to have emergency generators and the ability to restore quickly. When I was a boy a long time ago in the 1980s, I had 2 problems on reliability. The first was lightning, and the second, believe it or not, was the squirrels that were knocking off the newly found internet that we had established in the computer system. So the momentary outages caused by those 2 was most of my problem. But the future's not ours to see. In 1986, the National Science Foundation created this thing called the Internet, tying 5 colleges to the National Center of Atmospheric Research in Denver at a whopping speed of 56K bits per second. And that has made the possibility of this webcast today, but also, next slide, please, John. It's also a very scary place, as depicted in the Star Wars bar scene. There are a lot of bad creatures out there in terms of cybersecurity and how we protect the critical infrastructure. And we worry a whole lot. A lot of time is spent. We had about 50 plus man-hour equivalent at PJM focused on the cyber threats that we have across the system. Next slide, John. The National Infrastructure Advisory Council that I'm on, it's a presidential appointed committee, was asked to define major power outages, and we defined it as events beyond modern experience that exhaust our mutual aid capabilities that we have contracts in place for. it's likely to be an event that occurs with limited or no notice, such as what happens if you have a major New Madrid earthquake. It would be a long duration, at least 2 months or more likely 6 months to a year. It affects multiple states and regions, 50+ million people, and it causes severe cascading impacts across all of the critical infrastructure sectors. And backup generators start to fail, as was the case even during Sandy, which was a less than a 2-week event. So in my lingo, that means it's like the August 14th, 2003 blackout, but long like Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico actually, it was more than a year before all the power system was restored there. But black sky, high impact, low frequency events, we've seen some on Fukushima. Derechos, I didn't even know what that was until I had my first one down in Columbus, Mississippi. We had one at PJM in 2012 that was 200 miles wide, 600 miles long with 100-mile-an-hour wind. So it's almost like a hurricane event, except it's straight line winds. Storms like Sandy, like Katrina. And you think about the impact that we've had with past solar events and cyber I've talked about. Probably the biggest and hardest to predict is the EMP threat that could happen to the system. So there's opportunities in all of these areas. So next slide. To make this abstract concept of a big event more real, I decided to include some pictures here of the events that have occurred. And I might add, I have included the National Academy of Engineering's website there at the bottom. These slides will be posted so you can get to some of these reports. Now, the world is covered 2/3 by water and 1/3 by National Academy reports. So this is one thing that we have done a lot of study on. As a matter of fact, we have a report that's going out. I just approved it to go out for a review on what the grid of the future would need to look like. And we include in that report the need to have more focus on the natural gas system because it has become so important to supply generation, especially in the Marcellus zone where natural gas prices have become very competitive. Next slide. I just got back yesterday from driving to and from California. It was 114 hours of driving time total, but things that you don't really realize how bad it can be. This is here and now. The first days we got there, the upper right picture showing the orange sky, the Golden Gate Bridge from the New York Times, but lots of things that can come your way that you had never thought of before. And a firestorm like this, just showing the down transmission and the down distribution that occurs. The utilities there are working as we speak to try to keep as much power going as possible. As part of the NIAC recommendation to those, and I've really pared these down for this webcast, the link to the report at DHS is at the bottom. You can download that report free of charge. But the one thing we've seen is the need to clarify what federal authorities exist and what agencies and can be exercised so we know who to call on if you're in a major event like Hurricane Sandy or even the fire event in California. Develop federal outage guidelines and design bases, including standards. And a good example of this is following Hurricane Andrew in 1992, the design standard for wind was raised to 150 miles an hour, and Florida recovered very quickly when Puerto Rico did not recover for months following the same hurricane event. Provide resources to designate community enclaves. By that, where do I go to get water, and where do I go for that has emergency power for air conditioning in the summer and for heat in the winter for those that cannot survive without electricity in their homes. and design incentives to provide financial support and remove regulatory barriers. The thing that Avi was talking about in his introduction is how do we get the investments in resiliency that we need to survive the kind of events that we are now seeing across the world. We need to conduct more catastrophic power outage exercises, including all other critical infrastructures. We do a whole lot in terms of GridX, and John has done a tremendous job of international events of exercises, but we need to be very focused on tying it all together with the other critical infrastructures, especially water and telecom. And the natural gas pipeline standards, we've said in that report and the National Academy report that's still in draft that we need to have more standards in place to assure that the natural gas is flowing. We added 30,000 megawatts of natural gas while Frank Koza and I were at PJM. And we need to develop adaptable emergency communication systems. Avi is working on that with BSX, and I will say you cannot put a storm back together if you don't have communications. During Katrina, for example, all the cell towers and many of the radio towers failed with the wind speeds that they had, and we had to move in communication on wheels cows, and it delayed us probably 2 days in terms of getting the line crews up and working effectively and restoring the power during Katrina's recovery. This is in several National Academy reports. I like it a lot. It kind of carries you through the planning and preparation that Avi talked about in the introduction, the ability to be prepared to absorb a shock. Ameliorate means the ability to ride through it, to make it less worse, if you will, in terms of what the operators are doing as the disruption occurs across all critical infrastructures. And then after the event, the ability to get back to normal as quickly as possible, if not normal, to have all the critical infrastructure input that's in place, including our Black Start plan, working. And then down across the bottom is we learn from each of these events. So each time we are a little better. Next slide, please. I'm going to end where we started. The importance of what we're working on. Resiliency, the ability to take a lick and keep on ticking is very important. And it reminds us, click again, Josh. It reminds us that electricity is a lifeline, not just a bottom line. At the end of the day, the ability of having the power system back up will determine how quickly the economy recovers, how quickly individual lives come back together. With that, again, thank you very much, John, for including me here today.
Thanks, Terry.
Terry, thanks very much for the presentation. Our next speaker is Dave Rube. Dave is the current president of the Seagray U.S. National Committee and former director of electric transmission operations and reliability at Dominion Energy. Dave's focus will be on the electricity industry response to COVID and lessons learned. Dave?
Thank you, Frank. Go ahead to the next slide. Good. Most of this discussion is centered around information I've received from the IEEE as well as Seagray as they've been following the COVID response of electric utilities around the world, as well as conversations I've had with manufacturer colleagues as well as utility colleagues across the United States. The criticality of the electric infrastructure cannot be understated, as Terry has indicated, and it appears from everybody's response that that's understood across the globe. Operators in most countries had pandemic measures in place, and they were formulated primarily because of Ebola, SARS, and H1N1. But with this type of pandemic, they had to be adjusted to reflect the nature of COVID-19. One of the key points of all of their work was the safety of utility workers and their families. And that was paramount in their response, resulting in different approaches based on the country and its locality, as well as the spread of the virus. Travel immediately was restricted and temperature checks were initiated by most firms early in this pandemic. Next slide. The operating centers are critical to the operations of a utility, and most of them moved to various strategies in order to ensure continuous operations. Almost everyone across the world shifted to a different type of shift in the operating centers to reduce exposure. They went from 8 hours to 12 hours and took that third shift and made it a backup support crew. They moved to split shifts at primary and secondary control centers to prevent infection spread. Some areas provided on-site housing for operating personnel so they could be sequestered at work and not take the risks of going home and bringing it back to the workplace. All of them had deep cleaning and disinfecting between shifts. Some of the common components used by the operators, they restricted to each worker so that they didn't spread the virus among other workers. So such things as keyboards, the mouse they use, headsets, et cetera, were unique to that individual. And non-essential control room workers were moved to a virtual support setting to reduce the numbers in a control room. Next slide. When it comes to the field and office personnel, most of the office personnel initially used telecommuting to continue work. There's a large percentage today that's still telecommuting. They are starting to get some people back, but reduced numbers in the workplace. Field personnel operated in fixed teams with split shifts, using PPE such as the face masks, hand sanitizers, and social distancing. But they were trying to keep into fixed teams so that they didn't cross spread the virus to other teams, so they'd always have a workforce available. Work that could be deferred was delayed to reduce the numbers of personnel at a job site, and workers were asked not to take or use public transportation. Next slide. Some of the operating impacts was as the virus spread and the businesses shut down, there was a drastic changes in the load profiles. Commercial load was drastically reduced as nations began their shutdown, and load patterns tend to flatten. This resulted in less load, so that we had overvoltage issues were seen in various countries, and measures had to be taken to counter, such as opening transmission elements, the use of flexible AC transmission devices, and also fixed reactors in order to help control the overvoltages. They had to change generator schedules as needed to deal with the load change and help with some of the VAR requirements to help with the voltage control. Next slide. What this meant to the utilities is the day-ahead forecast had to be thrown out the window basically early on in this process. And so they were challenged due to this load pattern change because it never had the prior experience before. This required our operating centers to be very conservative on their reserve margins initially. And some utilities saw no impact in load reductions, but others with heavy commercial industrial load saw as much as a 20% load reduction during the height of the pandemic. The lower load created less dispatchable generation available in some countries as renewables were exceeding the load during certain times of the day. And this left the utilities with very little rotating dispatchable generation to help control some of the voltage and other impacts. So the contingency reactions were more difficult to control, and they ended up having to open up transmission elements. Operating personnel, after this thing continued for multiple months, started to exhibit stress-related issues for the long hours in the control room and the pressure of trying to deal with these drastic changes in load. On the supply chain side, initially supplies of necessary PPE, hand sanitizer, and cleaning supplies were in limited numbers, and that became a challenge for a lot of utilities to get there for their critical workers because they were competing with the medical profession. Contract personnel followed utility protocols and supported both virtually with their technical staffs and on-site with the required social distancing and PPE. And utilities had to go to remote factory acceptance for critical components due to travel restrictions, which reduces your ability to really understand issues you may have with this equipment once it arrives on site, and puts you a little bit of a risk when this equipment gets energized. Next slide. The impact of travel restrictions, materials from international firms were initially impacted by the travel restrictions between countries because they couldn't come into the nation, and that forced the deferment of some work, and some utilities just elected to suspend all major capital work as a result. The specialists needed for commissioning of sophisticated equipment that were unable to travel to job sites resulted in the delay of some work or the energization of new facilities, even though they were constructed. The timing hit and they just couldn't get there to help get the equipment in service, which shows some lack of technical expertise in certain countries, including the US. Next slide. Manufacturers in this industry are considered critical, and they kept working. They modified their work hours and shifts to ensure they could support this industry during this period while maintaining the health and safety of their workers by deep cleaning of work areas, providing PPE to their personnel, using hand sanitizer, etc. They separated their workstations to enforce the social distancing. They used their support personnel virtually. And for personnel that were already in country supporting work, they found themselves, as they tried to help support commissioning, not able to stay in hotels or restaurants. So they ended up renting RVs for field commissioning equipment so they could have housing and be able to feed their employees from grocery stores. Next slide. So some of the lessons learned, I think, as we went through this pandemic was black sky type events will impact the day ahead dispatch of generation due to an unknown load curve, which means we have to have conservative margins of dispatchable generation. As systems rely more on non-dispatchable generation, then measures such as the opening of transmission elements will become the first actions. That makes the grids weaker because you have no longer the strength of multiple parallel paths to support the network. International suppliers and their technical expertise were not available in the US, and this will impact electrical systems if travel or goods restrictions last for a long period of time. There's a need to identify materials and expertise critical for this nation in order to ensure some capability exists for national security. And spare equipment inventories, I feel, should be adjusted where international movement of goods or personnel may be impacted for black sky events, assuming you have a long duration on travel or good movement restrictions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Frank.
Dave, thanks very much. Appreciate your presentation. Our final speaker is Danny Lacker. Danny is the head of Water Security Emergency and Cybersecurity at the Israel Water Authority. Danny's comments will focus on Israel's approach to resilience and security in the water sector. Danny?
Thank you, everyone. It's a great honor being the last panelist. Next slide, please. So first of all, the product that we supply, water, is probably the most crucial and essential product, maybe beside Wi-Fi. But of course, we have to supply it anytime, any place. We cannot say to consumers we cannot supply water in period of time, although there might be problems in sometimes. Next slide, please. So I want to focus about Israel water system, not because it's that important, just to see the lesson learned that you have to make a planning according to hazards. In the past, through decades, Israel water supply used to be based on one main intake, the Sea of Galilee, as you can see in the slide. Next slide, please. Next, another person, another one, please, John. Thank you. But because of the terrible drought that we have during coming years, we changed the whole system, and we have today about 80% of drinking water in Israel come from desalination plants. So we are not relying on one intake anymore. We can lose through hazards few desalination plants, or the ability to supply from the Sea of Galilee or from thousands of wells underground water we have, we are not relying on one source. We are divided the risk already. Next slide, please. As you can see in this slide, then you can move on. John, thank you. So although we have a very good water system in Israel, we still have a lot of hazards. In our neighborhood in Israel, we can be contaminated because of terror action or because of a mistake or technical problem. We had cyber attacks during the last period of years from our enemies. We are sitting on the Syrian African reef. We are became through earthquakes or so on, technical problems and other issues. It's not that crucial. The main issue that every one of those hazards will be operated will have two challenges. One is lack of water, and the other one is quality water failure. Next one, please. So in Hebrew, we have a saying that says that God is in the small details. Sometimes it's not enough to make big plans. You have to go into the small details. And for instance, I'm going to give you an example of low-tech technology, not high-tech technology. In times of crisis, not like electricity or gas or fuel, it's not only that we have to fix and clean the system and make it operate again, because it could take a few hours and maybe even few days, we have to supply alternative water to our consumers. In the past, we used to supply it to those kinds of black tanks that you can see in those slides. It doesn't fit the 21st century. It takes a lot of problems, and people do not believe to drink water from those tanks. Next slide, please. So we are operating today in all water suppliers in Israel, a system that works on plastic systems with plastic tabs and, of course, a blizzard of water that we can supply an alternative clean water and can be carried and shipped in real good terms. Next one, please, John. And another one, please. And we even posted them in advance in parks, in sports courts, in schools. As you can see, there's a whole supplying water system under this bench, as you can see in the right picture. And it waits for times of crisis. You just have to come, open the lock, and you can supply alternative water to consumers in a park or in a school. And you don't have to shift equipment. It's already over there. As I was saying, you have to think about the small details and make logistics very clear and very easy in this period of time. Next one, John, please. Also, as you can see in this slide, when people are coming to consume water in times of crisis, they usually bring bottles or tanks from their homes. And I'm not sure if in those tanks, as you can see, there was fuel or oil or anything. So we, as the Israel Water Authority, bought for each consumer in Israel and posted them in all water suppliers. Next slide, please. What we call water pouches. One back, exactly. Those water pouches contains 1 gallon of water. While they're folded, they're good for 25 years. You can supply them in times of crisis to consumers, and they can come backwards and forwards and use it about 2 years in a row, and then you have to throw away this pouch. But eventually, they do not have to bring their dirty tanks from their homes. Next, please. Let's move on. We have the ability to control and operate all kinds of centers and commanding centers. Let's move on, please, John. But what we did, and I think that's kind of special in Israel, beside the abilities of the water suppliers and all the utilities to supply alternative water, we as the Israel Water Authority built ourselves and a national reserve that can supply water to around 400,000 people, meaning that if Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or other city in Israel will have a setup or a problem supplying alternative water, we can give them a backup with our abilities that we as Israel Water Authority can operate by ourselves. Next one, please. This is how it's stored. Never mind. Let's go on. Another crucial thing that we have to think about in times of crisis is sewage. We always think about how to supply alternative water, but we have to think about what we'll do with toilets when we don't have flowing water. That could be a terrible crisis that creates a lot of pandemics and so on. So we also build a reserve that can supply alternative toilets to consumers in times of crisis. Again, operates them in parks, in schools, and so on, and supply alternative toilets to a large scale of consumers in Israel. Next one. So we also have the ability to shift our reserve, and in few cases, like in Charleston, West Virginia, last September in the Bahamas, and in the Philippines in the past, we send delegations to give aid and supply some humanitarian aid to people that had problems supplying water or sewage problems. Next one, John. So now I'm going to focus about Corona or COVID-19 times, which all our system kind of got upside down, and we had to find some solutions. Next one. First of all, you cannot operate control centers in those kinds of Corona times. You don't put many people in the same room. So we couldn't operate our control centers, of course. Next one, John. And we couldn't go and reach to the consumers that had problems immediately as we are based. It's kind of an instinct. When someone has water problem, we're going and meet them at field. That's also a mistake in those kinds of in Corona times. Next one. And of course, you cannot put people together to consume alternative water as we usually do. Next one. So what we did is, of course, to deal with mainly four major challenges in the Corona time. First is, of course, to meet with a lot of fake news. We had a lot of problems of fake news, like the water are contaminated with Corona, you cannot use water, you have to boil them. Then we had a lot of alternative water distribution, which we have to change our way of thinking, and mainly we have to do it during multiple cyber attacks during this period of time. Next one, John. So what we did, we're checking on a daily basis all water suppliers in Israel and see, like Terry said, we check the abilities of the employees to come and keep on working on a daily basis, and we have plans how to support one each other. For instance, if Jerusalem has a problem with their employees, we can provide them aid from Tel Aviv and so on. Next one. As we're saying, you don't speak Hebrew, but this is an example of fake news that occurred in Israel National TV that says that, like in China, you have to boil the water before using them. We had to give in all the challenges and on the channel and explain to consumers that they can use water freely. Next one. And of course, we have to supply different kinds of alternative water supplies using bottled waters and also our pouches, bringing them to the houses of the consumers or controlling them without creating any people coming together and affecting one each other with the coronavirus. Next one. So eventually, if I want to summarize it, you have to make a plan in advance, but you have to be very going to the small details. And we're saying that no pain, no gain. If we do a lot of drills, what we did in the past, then we could change our abilities to react to this upside down situation, because people were trained and knew how to work one with each other. We knew how to approach the public and give them public information. And that's the reason that we succeed to operate in this period of time. Thank you.
Danny, thanks very much for the presentation, and thanks to all the presenters for their comments and thoughts. We do have some time for Q&A, so I want to, I guess, go back to Terry for a second. Terry, you've had a lot of experience with electrical system restoration. And I guess, what do you see as the major obstacles standing in the way of bringing the electric system back from a major outage like the kind we're talking about here?
Well, having headed a storm center for 20-something years, it's pretty straightforward that without voice communication, you cannot have a strong response for resiliency. You can't put the system back together. Now, I've lost control systems only twice in my 45-year career, but we were able to have operators in station giving us readings and capability. But I can't emphasize the importance, and it's not just the electric system, as Danny pointed out, the water system. Without communication, voice communication being first, data communication second, and then computer and computer control being third. But without a BSX type system that Avi's been working on, you can't respond to the event. In the case of Katrina, I mentioned communication on wheels. You can roll that in and get radios back up and running, but you're talking about wasting 2 to 3 days of response time. So my number one thing would be having communication so the emergency response for all critical infrastructures can go together. Thank you for the question, Frank.
Thanks, Terry. Dave Rube, let me turn to you for a second. You spoke about some aspects of the power system that really needed to be changed, I guess, to support operational issues that came up during the COVID situation. I guess, what do you think needs to be changed to drive resilience investments in the critical lifeline utilities? And is there an optimum approach to deal with that?
Well, there's finite resources and funding available to lifeline utilities, as you know, and today's focus is mainly on the move to renewable energy or inverter-based resources. There's a belief by some that this resolves the resiliency issue by distributing your generation resources. Unfortunately, in order to have resiliency, we really need to step back and take a more holistic approach to inverter-based resources, because they do not guarantee resiliency unless they're designed appropriately and can operate in harmony with each other, so you don't have exposure to other risks, or such as cybersecurity. The two things I think can be complementary, but this aholistic approach would also include the dynamic nature of the grid and the issues for restoration, because it will take a different approach. As Avi had mentioned, this lifeline compatible restoration is really important as we look at black start after a black sky event. And we really need to change the way our grid is configured after that type of event and bringing back to a minimum core grid. As discussed today, I think that we must consider our supply chains, as other high impact, low frequency events could impact our ability to obtain specialized materials or expertise from our world partners. And this should become part of our utility total owning costs and risk assessment when awarding critical equipment purchases. Our regulators, customers, and politicians need to support efforts that gain reliability and resiliency as we move to a carbon-free world of power generation. As far as an optimum approach, I guess my experience suggests that you can realize this with minimal incremental investment if performed as part of the infrastructure upgrades or renewal projects you have going, and if considered while they're being performed. Material selections can weigh sources of manufacture, the impact on your sparing policy and expertise needed outside of this nation, and measures to support how you're going to handle those materials during longer term travel restrictions. Thanks, Frank, for the question.
Okay, thanks, Dave, appreciate it. Danny, coming back to you, I guess the question for you is, what can be done, I guess, what's the challenge to dealing with the various other sectors and public organizations? What are those challenges for managers of utilities like yourselves to interact and effectively with the other sectors and public organizations? What can be done to improve that situation?
Thank you for the question, John. I think the main issue is to understand the dependency we have one on each other. I mean, without the ability to talk to my colleague in the electricity company, I won't be able to solve problems, and the opposite down as well. So that requires, of course, a good communication center and good communications ability, but also a lot of drills and a lot of understanding how we all work together, the municipal utility, all the infrastructures, of course, the ministries, and understand that we have to operate together if we want to succeed in emergency times. The other crucial thing is, of course, public information. I think that we all have to think about the thing that if public will react good terms and will understand our requirements and our problems as well, and we all will talk the same language through good communication, I think that could be the difference between succeeding a crisis and failing a crisis.
Good, Danny, thank you. Dave Rube, let me come back to you on that question. And Dominion obviously has done a lot of work in maintaining good relationship with public organizations and government authorities. What's your perspective on that? What do you see as the challenges for improving coordination there?
I agree with Danny. Communication is critical. The challenge I think we have between the organizations is how you share critical information and not expose a weakness in your network that some nefarious actor might take advantage of to impact the overall utility's health and well-being. So it's how you secure information and still have communications between the different sectors, enough communication so you can support each other. And that tends to be the challenge as we move forward. There's different strategies underway now that we're working on to look at a probability risk assessment type of approach or a criticality number to help look at where resiliencies are that you could support each other. And they may bear fruit, so you don't have to really lay out so much detail, but enough detail to each other that it helps both parties become more resilient and support each other better.
Good, Dave. Thanks. Appreciate that. Terry, I want to come back to you. The NIAC reports talk quite a bit about resilience investment. And I guess, what do you see? What needs to change, I guess, to drive the resilience investments for the critical lifeline utilities?
First of all, the making sure that the regulators, and I'm talking FERC here and the state and local regulators, whether it's U.S. or national, understands the importance of resiliency investment. We got there years ago, and I'm talking 25 years ago, that the reliability investments we were making in the grid were very important to the consumers, and therefore many of the systems we had put in that had radial feeds and no switches, et cetera, got replaced. But we haven't gotten to the point that the funding and recovery is there when you're spending money on resiliency. How do you ride through an event? And more importantly, how do you restore the system after an event? So one of the recommendations, a strong recommendation to the president, was that the regulatory bodies very much need to be involved. And they're getting much more involved on the cyber front because everyone sees the cyber risks that we're at. But in terms of what David Rube was talking about, how many inverters or too many inverters on the system? How do we replace the rotating mass on the system with the speed of the inverters and smart inverters? And to do that, we need some mechanism of recovery of the cost of those events.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Danny, you had mentioned that or you showed a slide, I guess, with the complexity of the Israel water system there. And I guess, what do you see as the major obstacles that stand in the way of bringing that system back from a major outage should it occur?
Well, there is an advantage, but there's also a disadvantage when you have a spread system. The reason that we do not rely on one intake or not rely on one structure is, of course, to deal with resiliency. But on the other hand, then you have to protect much more facilities and so on. The major problem could be, again, communication. How would we, as the Israeli Water Authority, will know and understand that in a small village or small town in Israel, we have a supplying crisis, of water supply crisis or sewage support crisis, and know that they are required our assistance and give them back some assistance or some equipment or some technical problems. We have to kind of get the full picture, and when you have a lot of and when you spread your risks, it also creates a challenge to understand exactly the picture. So that's the difference, beside spreading the risk, but on the other hand, know in times of crisis what exactly is going on and who can support himself, who requires some help from the Israel Water Authority or from the electricity company and so on. You have to play by those two, let's say, ends of the rope all the time.
Right. Well, thank you. Guys, we're trying to keep this within the 1 hour limit. So first of all, Terry, Dave, and Danny, I appreciate your participation, your presentations, and the discussion very much. We thank you for that. And with that, I want to basically turn it back to John, who will kind of wrap up the session and give you some information on future sessions. John?
Hey, Frank, thanks so much for facilitating that. And Terry and Dave and Danny, outstanding. And Avi, again, for laying the groundwork. Outstanding presentations. I appreciate it. Just a couple of things to cap off. EarthX 2020, the world's largest resilience exercise, is still available to you. The registration link is there. If you just Google EarthX, you'll come up to the registration site on the EIS Council page. We've had outstanding support. This year's exercise focuses on EMP and cyber. And as Danny talked about, cyber is the one that we just can't get away from. But I encourage you to play, join thousands of people across the world that have taken advantage of EarthX. And I think you'll be happy that you got a chance to test things in a virtual environment. I do want to point out where we're going with the GRCOM. Under Avi's leadership, we are moving forward with a series of events. One that I will hallmark for you here. We will release version 1 of the Global Resilience Framework in January 2021. That framework will be a little bit different than what you may have seen in the past. As Avi talked about, we're going to focus on things that can be accomplished in the near-term cycle, somewhere in the 12 to 24-month cycle. But the framework will be open. We'll look for your input. We will follow your direction as participating members, and I hope you will mark that on the calendar when we actually give you the dates. Our next GR webinar is going to actually be on the 28th of October. That one will start a little bit later, 1 hour later at 12 o'clock. We've got an outstanding panel that are going to talk about from the health and medical community, their lessons learned from COVID. And as what we're trying to get across is, if we've learned these lessons through COVID, they are probably and most likely applicable to any other major disaster or emergency, or just our resilience path forward. So with that being said, I appreciate everybody making time for this, and I appreciate Frank's willingness to facilitate. Again, thanks to Terry and Dave and Danny and Avi for their support today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the session. So you all have a great day, and thanks again for joining us.